When a police officer sees a young boy following him through the dark streets, he thinks it's just a lost child case. But when the boy hands the officer a crumpled note with shaking hands, the officer's blood runs cold. Before we get into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you support justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. That night, the city streets were unusually quiet, and there was a feeling that the whole world was holding its breath. Detective James cocked his coat even more. The cool breeze and the dull thud of his boots on the pavement were the only sounds he could hear. A storm was brewing, and he could feel it in the heavy silence. His shift had already gone on for too long, and the promise of a warm meal and a few hours of rest was all that kept him going. Out of the corner of his eye, James saw a small figure following him carefully. It was a boy no older than 8, with a skinny build and dirty clothes. The boy's face was red, and his wide, worried eyes darted around as if he thought danger was about to leap from the shadows. James slowed down to test the boy's intent, and sure enough, the boy hesitated, his steps faltering as he slid further into the dark recesses of the sidewalk. James stopped and turned to face him. "Hey kid," he called, his voice calm but with just enough authority to demand attention. The boy stopped in the middle of a step and looked down. He didn't answer or even look up, instead he grabbed something tightly. He had a crumpled piece of paper in his hand that looked like it had been folded and unfolded a million times. James's instincts went off. He had seen kids like this before, scared, malnourished, and too familiar with the bad parts of life. As he knelt down next to the boy, his tone softened. "It's okay, you don't have to be afraid," he said in a soft voice. The boy jerked when James extended his hand, and his tiny body shook as if he were getting ready for something. James stopped short of giving him the paper. James looked down at the boy's hand, which was still holding on to the piece of paper as if it were lifeline. "What's that?" he asked softly, pointing to the note. "Can I see it?" The boy hesitated, his eyes flickering up to meet James's for the briefest of moments. There was fear in those eyes, but also a desperate hope that James couldn't ignore. The boy slowly extended the paper, and James took it, carefully unfolding the worn note in the dim light of A. As he read the message, "Please help apartment 3B, and don't let him see you," his stomach tightened. The words hit him like a cold wind. He looked back at the boy, who was now pulling on his sleeve with urgent jerky movements. The boy's small hand shot out and pointed down the street to a building with cracked windows and peeling paint. James's heart raced as he saw the fear on the boy's face. "Who wrote this?" he asked, his voice steady but full of urgency. The boy shook his head and looked over his shoulder nervously, as if expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. His silence spoke louder than words. James's grip on the note tightened. He didn't know what was waiting for him in that building, but the boy's fear was contagious. He stood up and adjusted his radio and flashlight. "Stay here," he told him firmly, but the boy shook his head again and pleaded silently. James let out a sigh of relief when he realized what was going on. The child wouldn't let him go alone, so he said in a softer voice, "Okay, now you stick close to me and don't make a sound no matter what." The boy nodded, and their movements were shaky and hesitant. Together, they slowly made their way toward the tall building. The only sound breaking the silence was the distant rumble of thunder. James stopped at the base of the stairs, his hand hovering over his holstered gun. The boy tugged on his sleeve again, this time pointing to a window on the 3rd floor where faint. A flickering light came through the torn curtains, and James knew this wasn't a normal call. Whatever was waiting for him inside would change everything. The crumbling apartment building stood in front of him. Its peeling paint and broken windows seemed to taunt the newly built blocks just a few streets away, showing that two very different worlds existed next to each other. Detective James felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach, a mix of caution and unease. As they got closer to the door, James looked down at the boy who was holding onto his arm like a lifeline. The boy's thin frame shook with every step, and his wide eyes darted nervously to every sound, like the faraway roar of a car engine or the bark of a dog a few blocks away. The boy flinched at the sound of broken glass under James's boots, and his head spun around as if he thought someone was coming out of the shadows. James could feel the tension radiating from the boy, a silent scream for help. The building itself wasn't much better, the front security door. There was graffiti on the brick walls and a few rusted mailboxes that were hanging open with long-lost mail. James instinctively scanned the area, noticing that the light fixtures above the entrance flickered and cast uneven shadows on the cracked pavement. He reached for his radio and pressed the button with practiced ease. "This is Detective James. I'm at 1420 Madison investigating a possible situation. There are no active reports on file for this address." "Correct," the dispatcher's voice came back after a short pause. "That's right, Detective. There has been no recent activity. Please proceed with caution." James replied in a low voice. The lack of an official report made him even more uneasy. He turned off the radio and looked back at the boy. "Listen, kid," he said softly, "you need to stay close, but if I tell you to stop or stay back, you listen to me." The boy nodded hesitantly, his small hands gripping James's sleeve tight. James's mind was racing with ideas like what could be in apartment 3B that was making this child so scared. In the lobby, the air was thick and musty, with a faint but noticeable smell of mildew. The walls, which used to be a cheery yellow, were now covered in grime and had a sickly beige streak running through them. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, flickering sporadically and casting the room in an airy half-light. James pointed to a dusty bench near the stairs and said, "You can sit here while I check." He tried to be as calm and steady as possible, but the boy's response was immediate and angry. He shook his head furiously and tightened his grip on James's sleeve as he pulled closer. "Okay," James said, "stay behind me and be quiet." The boy agreed, and the two of them walked toward the stairs, the sound of their footsteps filling the otherwise quiet building. With each step, James's senses became sharper. The forest had taught him to pay attention to the little things that others miss. Scuff marks ran along the edges of the stairs, as if heavy things had just been dragged up them. A faint but strong smell of something sour and unwashed wafted down from above. It wasn't strong enough to be immediately alarming, but it was clear enough to make James's instincts hum with unease. Halfway up the stairs, James stopped and looked over his shoulder. The boy was following silently, his small body almost stuck to the detective's shadow. James motioned for him to stop, then looked up at the hallway above. The fluorescent light at the top of the stairs flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows. It was so quiet that the faint creak of a floorboard above them sounded unusually loud. When they got to the second floor, James scanned the hallway, his trained eyes looking for subtle signs of movement. As they passed a row of closed apartment doors, he saw a faint flicker of motion behind one of the peepholes. The person inside quickly moved away, but not before James caught the. He whispered to the boy, "Just keep moving," as his hand instinctively brushed against the holster at his hip and his thumb rested lightly on the strap. As they continued up the next set of stairs, the tension grew with each step. By the time they reached the third floor, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and the smell from before was stronger, mixing with something else, a faint metallic tang that James couldn't quite place, that made him nervous. The boy pulled at his jacket sleeve again, pointing a shaking finger toward the end of the dimly lit hallway and apartment 3B. At first glance, the door didn't look like anything special. Its tarnished brass numbers hung slightly off-center. But James's eyes quickly picked up on details that other people might miss. The worn carpet had faint muddy footprints that stalked right in front of the door. The paint around the lock was scratched, making it look like the door had been forced open and quickly fixed more than once. James put his hand on the boy's shoulder. As he slowly walked up to the door, every muscle in his body tensed up and alert. Just as he raised his hand to knock, he stopped in its tracks, a child's scream. James's heart raced as he tried to hear it. The voices were too low and hard to make out, but the tone was clear, anger. He looked down at the scared boy and saw that the child was nodding toward the door, confirming what he already knew. Something was very wrong in apartment 3B. He hesitated before reaching for the door handle, knowing that if someone inside was in danger, waiting could cost valuable seconds. He weighed his options carefully as his heart raced as he thought about what to do next. The cries from inside the apartment were getting louder. Do you think James made the right decision to investigate the apartment on his own? What do you think he'll find behind those doors, answers, or even more danger? Let us know in the comments. Check out this video, and don't forget to subscribe to find out the truth. James stepped forward, his boots barely making a sound on the worn carpet. The tarnished brass 3B on the door hung slightly crooked, as if it had been slapped on without care. Nothing about the door screamed trouble, but James could feel his instincts telling him otherwise. He raised his hand and knocked firmly, "Police." He called out in a calm but authoritative voice. For a split second, everything in the apartment seemed to stop the muffled voices that had been. James knocked again, this time harder, saying, "This is the police. Open the door." There was no response. James looked down at the boy, who pointed to the base of the door without saying anything. A thin line of light socked through the gap, making it seem like someone had moved just beyond it. James knelt down for a moment, narrowing his eyes at the fresh scuff marks near the doorknob. The scratches told a story of hasty tapping, which made the knot in his stomach tighten. The boy tugged on James's sleeve again. James straightened up and followed the boy's shaking hand down the hallway. There were faint but clear muddy footprints leading toward the fire escape at the far end. The footprints weren't just random, they formed a purposeful trail, like someone trying to get away quickly. James took a step back from the door, his mind working quickly on how the situation was changing. It wasn't just about a crying child behind a locked door. There was intent and calculation in how the scene had been set. Reached for his radio and spoke in low tones so as not to scare anyone who might still be inside. "This is Detective James. I need help at 1420 Madison 3rd floor apartment 3B. Possible suspects may be on foot heading for the fire escape. Approach with caution." James then sent a copy of the message to the quick response units en route. The boy tugged on his arm again, his fear growing stronger by the second. "Listen to me," James said firmly but gently. "I need you to go downstairs and wait at the..." The boy's lip quivered, and for a moment James thought he might refuse. But with a shaky nod, the boy turned and started to make his way back down the stairs, his small frame tensing with each step. James turned back to the door. There were faint scuff marks around the lock, which suggested a hasty entry, but the lock itself seemed to be in good shape. He put his ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. At first, there was only the oppressive silence of the... Then he faintly heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of floorboards, as if someone was trying to move without being seen. His heart raced, and he carefully tried to unlock the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard it, the sound of hurried footsteps coming from inside. Whoever was there was moving toward the fire escape. James stepped back from the door, thinking about his options. The sound of footsteps showed that the apartment wasn't empty, but whoever was inside was now aware of his presence. Drawing his gun, James got ready to kick the door in. His muscles tensed up as he got ready for the impact, and adrenaline rushed through him. Just as he shifted his weight to break the door, he heard the faint sound of a window sliding open. His head snapped to the end of the hallway, where the fire escape was. The race was on, and the stakes had just been raised. The sound of the window sliding open was like a starter pistol going off in James's mind, and he ran down the stairs. Walking down the hallway toward the fire escape, his boots slamming into the worn carpet as he got to the farthest window. He threw it open and climbed up, his breath clear in the cold night air. The fire escape groaned under his weight. The old metal structure was barely holding together as he stepped onto it. He looked down and saw a person descending quickly, their movements quick and deliberate, and a big duffel bag swinging wildly as they leaped from one landing to the next. "Stop, police." When James yelled, his voice cut through the stillness of the alley. The figure didn't hesitate. They skipped the last set of steps and fell the last few steps to the ground with a thud, then ran down the dark alley. James clenched his teeth and chased after the figure. The fire escape creaked and swayed as he went down, forcing him to move carefully so he wouldn't fall through the rusty grates. As soon as his feet hit the ground, he ran after the suspect. The path was narrow and crowded with overflowing dumpsters and trash. The dim light of the street lights only partially lit the way ahead. James caught glimpses of the suspect, their silhouette darting between Shadow's trash cans, which clattered to the ground as they tried to slow him down. "Stop," James barked again, this time with a firm voice that said, "You're not going to get away." The suspect looked back briefly but didn't break stride. Their face was partially hidden by a hood, but James. They looked scared, and that was enough for him. He pushed himself harder, stepping in puddles and loose gravel as he closed the gap. Taking out his radio, James called out, "Dispatcher, suspect is on foot heading west through the alley off Madison, male approximately 6 feet, dark hoodie carrying a duffel bag. Request backup immediately, copy that," which was answered by units en route. The suspect turned left and disappeared into a narrower passageway between two buildings. He followed without hesitation, the adrenaline easing the pain in his legs. The passage was even darker than the alley, with walls pressing in on both sides. He could hear the suspect's labored breathing just ahead, which made him push even harder. The chase almost ended when James tripped over a loose pallet and barely caught himself before hitting the ground. The suspect had gained a few more feet, but the alley suddenly opened into a small lot full of trash, and James watched as the suspect ran away. They tripped over a broken piece of concrete and fell to the ground. James jumped in and tackled them, and the impact sent both of them rolling across the asphalt. James pinned the suspect on their stomach with his weight while yanking a pair of cuffs from his belt and growling, "Stay down," as he snapped the cuffs around the suspect's wrists. During the struggle, the suspect's duffel bag fell open, spilling its contents all over the ground. James's eyes quickly searched the items. A heavy-duty flashlight, duct tape, rope, and a roll of plastic sheeting. His stomach turned. This wasn't just some small-time thief. "What's in the bag, huh?" James asked in a low, sharp voice. "What were you planning to do with this?" The suspect remained silent, their body tense but still. James turned them over and studied their face in the dim light of a nearby light. They looked younger than he thought, probably in their mid-20s, with a blank, almost defiant look in their eyes. "You're going to tell me what's going on here," James said in a cold and steady voice. "Who are you working with? What's in apartment 3B? The suspect didn't answer, so James grabbed them by the arm and pulled them to their feet. The fight was over, but the questions kept coming. Who was this person? What were they planning to do with the things in the bag? Why did they run away so quickly? As James looked around the lot for his next move, a small voice broke through the tent. "What's in apartment 3B? The boy stood at the edge of the alley, his chest heaving as if he had run the whole way. His eyes were wide with fear, and his hand was frantically pointing back toward the building. "They're still in there," the boy cried, his voice cracking with urgency. James's blood ran cold. The chase, the bag, and the suspect had all been a distraction. As he ran back toward the apartment building, the boy's small hand gripped his own with a vice-like grip. The child's ragged breaths matched James's as they burst. Through the front door, the sound of police sirens cut through the night, getting louder as more units arrived. Uniformed officers were already dattering in the dimly lit hallway of the third floor, their radios crackling with coordinated updates. "Apartment 3B, one of the officers said, nodding toward the door as James approached. His tone was clipped, and his stance was tense. Every face in the room showed the same unease. James looked down at the boy, whose wide eyes were fixed on the tarnished brass number on the door. The boy was shaking, but he wouldn't let go of James's hand. James knelt down and said, "I need you to stay back for a moment." "Okay, we'll take care of this." The boy hesitated, then nodded, reluctantly letting go of James's hand. He took a step back and pressed himself against the wall, his small fists clenched at his sides. James turned to the officers and said, "Let's move." The team took their positions, weapons drawn. The officer with the battering ram stepped forward and raised it high before slamming it into the door. The lock gave way. With a deafening crack, the door swung inward, revealing a scene that made every officer stop. The air hit James like a physical force, thick and sickeningly smelling of decay and filth. The narrow entryway led into a dimly lit living room, with a single bulb flickering weakly overhead. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing more horrifying details with each sweep. The walls were lined with crude makeshift beds, with old mattresses that were stained and torn and piled high with thin thread-covered mattresses and chains that were attached to bolts embedded in the walls. Toys were strewn across the room, their bright colors dulled by grime. In the corner, a small table held a variety of empty food containers, their contents long since rotting and filling the room with an unpleasant smell. James's stomach was turning, but he forced himself to focus and sweep the room. He told his voice to stay steady, even though anger and fear were rising inside him. One of the officers called out, "Over here." James pointed his flashlight at the 3 kids under 10 were huddled together in the far corner of the room. Their faces were pale and hollow, and the oldest was holding a younger boy who looked like he was unconscious. The boy's breathing was shallow, and his small chest moved in painful, uneven motions. James stepped forward slowly and knelt a few feet away. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're here to help." The girl didn't answer, but she tightened her grip on the unconscious boy. Her younger brother, who was no more than 5 years old, clung to her and buried his face in her shoulder. The boy who had led James to the scene stood frozen in the doorway, his breath catching as his eyes locked on the scene. "My sister," he whispered, his voice breaking. James's chest tightened as he looked back at the boy, then returned his attention to the children in front of him and barked for help. While the police searched the rest of the apartment, James stayed with the kids and talked to them. Softly and slowly, he reached for his radio. 3 teens were found in apartment 3B, with one being critically injured and pleading for immediate medical help. The girl looked at James warily but desperately. "You're safe now," and he told her. The sound of approaching sirens came in through the broken window, and James could hear his co-workers calling out their findings from the rooms next door. "Fake passports in here," one officer yelled. "Burner phones and cash," came another voice. James's eyes fell on a ledger that had been left behind. Carelessly left on the kitchen counter, he stood, measured his steps, and picked it up. Flipping through its pages, he quickly realized what it meant: names, dates, and dollar amounts scrolled in neat columns, transactions, human lives reduced to a spreadsheet. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just one cruel act, it was part of a larger, more planned operation. An officer called out, "Detective, we have paramedics coming up." James nodded and took a step back as the paramedics entered the room. The doctors quickly checked the unconscious boy's vital signs and gently persuaded the older girl to let go of him. She reluctantly did, and James turned his teary face toward her and said, "Stay with me," in a calm but firm voice. "We'll make sure he's okay." As the medics carried the children out one by one, the boy from the hallway hesitantly stepped forward. As they passed, his sister reached out and he grabbed her hand, holding it tightly. It was a short but powerful moment of comfort and reassurance. James looked back at the officer's bag and said, "We need it all." He then went outside to catch his breath and tried to process the scene he had just left. The cold night air didn't help clear his mind, but the sound of tires screeching broke through his reverie. James looked up just in time to see an unmarked van speeding off from the curb, its tail lights disappearing into the night. "Did anyone catch that?" he yelled as he spun toward the van. The closest officer said, "No plates," and James shook his head. They left too quickly, and James's jaw tightened. Whoever was in that van had seen the police and run away. They were connected to this, he was sure of it, and now they were gone. The scene outside the apartment building was very different from the suffocating silence James had left inside. Police were putting up yellow tape to block off the area, and crime scene technicians were unloading their gear. As soon as the children were rescued, they were quickly wrapped in warm blankets and carried to waiting ambulances. The boy who had led James there clung to his sister's side, his small frame pressed against hers, as if he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. As soon as James stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap, and his eyes automatically went to the street where the unmarked van had disappeared moments before, its tail lights long gone and swallowed up by the darkness. He reached for his radio and muttered, "This is Detective James." I need an APB on an unmarked black van with no plates that is thought to be connected to a human trafficking operation. Last seen heading east on Whitaker Street. The dispatcher replied almost right away, "Detective, we've got a problem. Reports are coming in that the plates on that van are registered to a stolen vehicle, most likely a fake." James cursed under his breath and tightened his grip on the radio. He knew that whoever was behind this had thought of everything. Operation had been carefully planned, and now the trail was slipping through his fingers. Determined not to let it end there, James turned to the nearest group of officers and said, "I want every shop, diner, gas station, and other place with a view of this street to be canvassed." As the officers spread out, James decided to take a different approach. He made his way down the block, scanning the buildings for anything that might give him a clue. His gut told him that the van's presence near the apartment wasn't a good sign. It was a coincidence that it had probably been parked there more than once before. The glow of a 24-hour diner caught his eye. Inside, a man was drinking coffee and picking at a plate of fries. His uniform showed that he worked the night shift, so James decided to start there. The bell above the door rang as James walked in, and the smell of grease and stale coffee hit him. The man barely looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Excuse me," James said, flashing his badge. "Detective James is looking into an incident at the... Do you mind if I asked you a few questions about the apartment building down the street?" The man sighed and pushed his plate away. "I don't know much about that place, as far as I can tell, it's just a rundown building." James leaned on the counter and spoke in a firm but not rude voice. "I'm not trying to make your night harder, but this is serious, kids' lives are on the line." The man hesitated and drummed his fingers on the counter before finally saying, "Yes, I've seen it a few times now that you bring it up. It happened late at night, around now." The man said, "Did you get a look at the driver?" James asked, his heart beating faster. "Not really," the man replied, "but there was something about him. He had a scar here, tapping his left cheek." "That's all I got," James said, pulling out a notebook and writing down the description. It wasn't much, but it was something. A scarred driver, a van seen multiple times, pieces of a puzzle he would need to put together quickly. When his phone rang, it was a message from an officer inside the building telling him, "You need to see this." James quickly ran back inside, weaving through the hallway until he reached the unit in question. The door was locked, and the scene inside was just as creepy as the first apartment. Children's clothes were strewn across the floor, along with small bottles of medicine and half-eaten food. But what caught James's eye were a bunch of photos stuck to a corkboard on the wall. Stepped closer and looked at the pictures more closely. They showed a park, an empty warehouse, and a rest stop on the side of the road. Each one had a date and what looked like initials written in the corner. As James put these pictures together, his mind raced with ideas. These weren't random, they were probably drop-off points or other holding sites in the trafficking network. An officer behind him asked, "Should we bag these?" James nodded and took a few pictures with his phone before stepping back and saying, "Get them to the lab." As the scene fell silent, James felt the weight of the case settle heavily on his shoulders. The boy who had led him there was sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance, his eyes fixed on his sister, who was being checked out by paramedics. The boy's fear was palpable. It was the same fear that had led him to follow a stranger through the night in search of help. Just as James was about to leave, his phone rang, and he quickly answered it. Recognizing the number as a number from a different precinct, Detective James said that a voice on the other end of the line greeted him. "Detective, this is Riley from the 14th Precinct. I heard about your case. We just recovered a van matching your description." Riley's somber response, "You're not going to believe what we found in it," made James's heart jump. The 14th Precinct's garage was busy, with the dull thud of heavy doors and the clatter of tools creating an air of tension. A mood of controlled chaos was created by the muffled voices. Detective James walked into the room and looked around until he saw Riley, a Sharpie detective, standing next to the impounded van. The black paint on the car was scratched and dull, like a silent witness to its own dark history. Riley called out to James, waving him over, "We've bought something for you, but it's not pretty." James approached Riley with his jaw set. "Let's see it." Riley opened the back of the van and showed the gutted interior. The walls had been taken down, leaving a large area of scratched metal flooring. At first glance, it looked empty, but one of the texts noticed new weld marks on the floorboards. Riley explained that this was under a hidden panel and pointed to a small table with evidence bags neatly arranged. James leaned in, his stomach tightening as he took it all in. There were stacks of fake documents, like passports, birth certificates, and medical records. Next to them were photos of children, with faces that ranged from blank to terrified. James's eyes froze on one of the pictures. Image, especially the boy who had led him to the apartment. He picked up the picture, his hands getting tighter around this kid. His voice was low and shocked. "How the hell did he get away?" Riley shook his head. "We don't know, but the fact that his picture was here means he was involved in this, maybe even recently. The fact that he got away alive is nothing short of a miracle." James's mind raced as he put together what he had already seen and heard, the boy's fear and his insistence on leading him to that specific apartment. It all pointed to A. He put the picture down and looked at a detailed map spread out on the table. "What's this?" James asked, looking at the lines that crossed several states. Riley tapped the map with his pen to show routes, interstate highways, and possible drop-off points. "It looks like this network covers at least 4 states, and maybe even more. For years, they've been moving kids without being caught." James's stomach turned as he saw small notes next to each route with initials, dates, and what looked like amounts. "The letter we found in the apartment," flashed through James's mind. "It has the same pattern of initials, dates, and routes, which means that the shipments Riley started were for the kids." James finished his sentence with a heavy sigh. The weight of the discovery was pressing on him. "If these are just the routes we found, who knows how many more there are?" Riley grimaced and said, "That's right. We ran the van's bin and traced it back to a shell company that led us to a name, Harvey Travers." James's eyes narrowed. "Travers, who is he?" Riley said he's a ghost with no digital footprint and no fixed address, but he's been linked to trafficking rings in the past. His skills in transportation make him nearly impossible to track. He knows how to move people and goods without leaving a trace. The name stuck out in James's mind uncomfortably. A man like Travers wasn't just dangerous, he was also meticulous and planned out every move. James thought of the children he'd found in the apartment, their hollow eyes, and he couldn't shake the feeling that these shaking frames were just the tip of the iceberg. His phone buzzed, interrupting his train of thought. It was a message from one of the officers at the precinct. The boy, the terrified, silent boy, was still refusing to speak. A child psychologist had been called in, but the boy was still not responding, his eyes fixed on something far away that he couldn't reach. James clenched his jaw. The boy wasn't just a witness, he was a key piece of this puzzle, but whatever he knew was buried deep and locked away by. James felt a huge sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a case, it was personal. If the boy had been able to escape, he must have seen or experienced something that could lead them to the others, but how could they get in touch with him? Riley's voice brought James back to the present. "Okay," James said, "I'm just thinking about the boy. He's been through hell, but I don't think he's ready to talk." Riley agreed, "That's understandable, but they warned, but time is running out if Travers finds out about this." James's phone rang again, this time from an unknown number. He frowned and stood up to answer it. "Detective James," came the cold, measured voice. "I suggest you stop digging." James's grip on the phone tightened as he asked, "Who is this?" The voice kept talking, ignoring his question, "Keep pushing and the next kid won't be so lucky." The line went dead. James stared at the screen, his heart racing. His fingers itched to redial, but he knew it wouldn't help because whoever had called was careful, calculated, and determined to. Riley asked, "Send a message, what is it?" James held up his phone, his jaw tight in a threat, "They know we're onto them." Riley's face darkened, "This operation is bigger than we thought." James nodded, His mind was already spinning with possibilities. Whoever was behind this had just made a mistake. They tried to scare him, but all they did was fuel his determination. He looked back at the evidence on the table and saw photos of children who had been reduced to names and numbers on a ledger. Stopping, James said in a steely voice, "Not until we bring them down." The camera then moved to one of the places shown in the pictures, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The warehouse stood out like a dark sentinel at the edge of the industrial district, its tall walls and rusted roof making a stark silhouette against the dim glow of city lights in the distance. James sat in the lead surveillance vehicle, his eyes fixed on the structure through binoculars, and the radio on his shoulder cracked occasionally. Over the radio, Officer Daniels' soft voice asked if there was any movement. "Negative," James replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay sharp." The hours went by in intense silence. The industrial road was eerily quiet, except for the occasional distant hum of a passing train. Inside the warehouse, faint lights flickered sporadically, but there was no sign of activity. James moved in his seat, his muscles tense from the long wait. Stillness, he looked with glee at the pictures of kids on the dashboard, each one a somber reflection of what was at stake. The kids' faces stared back at him, their eyes hollow with fear. It was 2:47 a.m. A van came out of the shadows, its headlights off, and cautiously approached the warehouse. James leaned forward and tightened his grip on the binoculars. The van matched the description of the car they had tracked down earlier, right down to the dents on the rear bumper. "Target's here," James murmured. The radio operator said, "Stay ready, no one moves until I say so." The van stopped near a side entrance, and two figures got out. One was short and stout, walking purposefully around to the back of the van. The other man was taller and had a baseball cap that partially covered his face, but it was clear that it was Harvey Travers. The taller man moved with authority, barking orders as the PA began unloading crates from the van. James whispered, "We've got our guy." The team stayed where they were. James kept looking at the crates. They weren't marked, but the men's careful, hurried handling of them told him a lot about what they were carrying. It wasn't normal cargo. Soon, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up next, and James's heart rate went through the roof as he saw two more men, SP and Travers, step out and have a short conversation before going inside the warehouse. Things were starting to come together. This wasn't just a drop-off, it was a hug, a keynote in the trafficking network, and Team 1 was getting ready to intercept. As James raised his hand to give the signal, officers quietly got out of their cars and moved around the warehouse, blocking all exits. The plan was simple: surround the warehouse, arrest the suspects before they could destroy evidence or escape. But just as James raised his hand to give the signal, one of the suspects stopped in the middle of a step, his eyes darting to an officer hiding in the shadows. "Hey, someone's out there," the man yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. The quiet night broke out into a commotion. Travers yelled orders, and the men were spread out, with some running back into the warehouse and others jumping into the vehicles. Meanwhile, officers sprang into action, yelling commands and blocking exits. James jumped from his position, his heart racing as he chased one of the suspects who had run inside. The man was quickly weaving through the maze of crates and equipment that was lying all over the warehouse floor. James pushed himself harder, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. As he followed the sound of hurried footsteps inside, he yelled stop, and his voice echoed off the metal walls, but the suspect didn't stop. Instead, he hid behind a stack of crates, and the sound of his footsteps became faint. James rounded the corner just in time to see a trap slam shut. He approached carefully, his flashlight shining on the scratched edges of the wooden hatch. He yanked it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air was cold and damp, carrying a faint but. Milo and despair filled the air, and he hesitated for a split second before descending the stairs with his flashlight casting long, very shadows on the concrete walls. The stairs creaked under his weight, and he took short, sharp breaths as he prepared for what lay ahead. At the bottom, the beam of his flashlight swept across the room, revealing a sight that chilled his blood. 12 children, their small bodies huddled together on the floor, stared back at him with wide, terrified eyes. The youngest child couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old. 4 years old, her tiny frame shaking as she clung to an older boy. James's heart clenched as he took in the scene, thin, dirty blankets over their shoulders, bruises on their arms, and a hollow look of exhaustion and hunger on their faces. They flinched as his light passed over them, their instincts to run away from authority clear. "It's okay," James said, lowering his flashlight to avoid scaring them even more. "I'm here to help you." "You're safe now," one of the older boys said. A boy about 10 years old hesitantly stepped forward, his eyes darting to the stairs behind James. "He'll come back," the boy whispered, his voice shaking with fear. "He always comes back," James assured him, "but not this time." He pulled out his radio and said, "Officer James here, I've got multiple victims in the basement, need paramedics, and additional units immediately. Secure the perimeter and lock it down." As James spoke, the boy's eyes stayed on the stairs, his face a mix of fear and disbelief. It wasn't until the sound of it was over when the sirens went off, and some of the tension in the room went away. James said that what he had said was as much for himself as it was for the children, but even as he led them to safety, he couldn't get rid of the weight of what he had found or the thought of how much more there might be to this horrifying operation. The heavy smell of mildew and old air clung to the basement, and the rough beds and strewn-out belongings were stark reminders of the horrible things the children had been through. Emergency lights from outside cast faint, rhythmic flashes across the walls around him. Paramedics knelt by the children, checking for signs of dehydration and malnutrition, while their voices were low and soothing. James knelt next to the boy who had first followed him. The child's small frame shook under the blanket a paramedic had put over his shoulders, and his wide eyes darted around the room as if looking for something or someone in the chaos. "You're safe now, James," said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." The boy's lips quivered, but he didn't speak. Instead, he clung tightly to the younger girl sitting next to him. Her hollow cheeks and vacant expression broke James's heart. The siblings had been through so much together, but their bond was unbreakable. The radio clip on James's shoulder crackled to life with the report of 2 more suspects in custody, but Travers was still missing. James's jaw tightened. Harvey Travers' name hung over the operation like a dark cloud. He was the mastermind behind the whole network, and his escape was a bitter pill to swallow. He looked up the stairs, half expecting Travers to reappear like a phantom, but the suspect had disappeared into the night. "Keep searching," James replied. "We can't let him get away." He turned his attention back to the kids and saw one older boy, maybe 11 or 12, sitting on the edge of a makeshift bed with his eyes fixed on the floor and his posture stiff as if bracing himself. For the worst, James slowly knelt down to meet his gaze and said, "Hey buddy, I know you've been through a lot. Is there anything you can tell me that might help us stop the people who did this?" The boy's hands were clenched into fists on his lap, and James thought for a moment that he wouldn't answer. The boy then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, "They moved us all the time. Sometimes it was houses, sometimes it was places like this." James nodded, "Hey buddy." The boy hesitated, his brow furrowing as he searched his memory. "There was a man with a scar. He was in charge when they moved us. He'd yell at the others if they didn't go fast enough," James said, connecting the description to other witness accounts. "Do you know his name?" the boy asked. "No, but I heard them talking about a final shipment. They said it was happening soon. I don't know what it means, but they sounded scared like they had to." James felt his stomach drop as he heard the words "final shipment." They suggested that the traffickers were planning to take the last few children out of the country, where they would be safe from the police. The case became 10 times more important. "Thank you," James said in a stern voice, "you've been incredibly brave." The boy didn't answer, but his shoulders relaxed slightly as if he was relieved to have shared what he knew. Back at the precinct, James sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of evidence. The wall clock kept going, but it didn't seem like time was passing. Every second he wasn't after Travers was a second he wasn't chasing him. He looked through the ledger that he had found in the warehouse, comparing it to the photos and maps that he had found during the race. The pages were filled with initials, dates, and strange symbols that made it seem like an impossible puzzle to solve. James's pen hovered over a torn piece of paper that had partial coordinates on it, but its edges were frayed, as if it had been torn off of a bigger document. "Come on," he said. While he was thinking about what he was hiding, he heard a knock on his desk. It was Officer Daniels, holding a hot cup of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, setting the cup down next to him and saying, "Thanks." James didn't even look at the coffee. He was too focused on the evidence in front of him. "Any leads?" Daniels asked, leaning against the desk. "Not yet," James replied, "but I have a feeling this," pointing to the coordinates. "I just need to figure it out." Daniels nodded gravely and said, "Get him, James Travers can't run forever." Meanwhile, in a quiet part of the precinct, the boy who had followed James to his apartment was talking to a child psychologist. The woman's voice was soft and patient as she talked to him, and her presence didn't bother him. The boy was holding on tight to a plush toy that the paramedics had given him. "It's okay," the psychologist said gently. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready. But if there's anything you remember." The boy hesitated, his eyes darting to the window. Finally, he whispered, "A lighthouse." "Can you tell me more about it?" The psychologist tilted her head and asked. The boy's voice was shaking, but he was determined. "We stayed near one. I saw it from the window. It had a red stripe. It was really tall." The psychologist nodded and wrote down, "That's very helpful. Thank you for sharing." She then gave the information to James, who immediately compared the boy's description with the rough coordinates. As he put the numbers on a digital map to narrow the search area, a red-striped lighthouse appeared on the screen. It was less than 50 miles from the precinct. James suddenly stood up and grabbed his jacket. "Daniels, get a team ready," he yelled. "Resolute, we've got a lead." As the team moved in, James felt a renewed sense of determination. They were closing in, and this time he wouldn't let Travers get away. Heavy fog covered the shipping dock, casting a veil of gray over the area. Flashlights lit up the area. As James and the SWAT team moved in almost silent formation, they measured their breathing, drew their weapons, and kept their senses sharp. In the distance, the tall, foreboding lighthouse with its distinctive red stripe stood out, its slow-rotating beam barely penetrating the thick fog. The air was damp and cold, and every sound was amplified: the faint creak of moving shipping containers, the distant cry of a seagull, and the quiet scuffle of boots on wet pavement. James looked around and said, "This place has plenty of blind spots." The dock was like a maze of rusting shipping containers, stacked crates, and abandoned vehicles. Tire tracks in the mud, discarded food wrappers, and a half-extinguished cigarette proved what they had been afraid: they were in the right place. Traffickers had been here recently, and it was likely they hadn't gone very far. James told the team to split up into smaller groups, and he led his group carefully between rows of containers. The boy's story about the lighthouse led them here, but now every step felt like going deeper into the unknown. As they moved forward, faint voices could be heard through the fog. James froze and raised his fist to tell his team to stop. The voices were muffled but clear, two men talking quickly and in a low voice. He motioned for his group to follow him as he crept toward the sound, his heart racing. As they turned a corner, they saw a container with its door slightly open and light pouring out from inside. James heard the faint sound of children crying, which made him feel rushed. He told his team to fan out and surround the area, and he barked, "Police, don't move." As they got closer to the container, the two men inside bolted, one going to the far end of the dock and the other disappearing into the fog. James' team chased them, but he stayed behind, focusing on the locked container. He knelt next to the door and pressed his ear against the cold metal. The cries inside became louder, a mix of fear and relief. One of the officers gave James a crowbar and, with practiced precision, they pried open the container. When the door swung open, they saw a heartbreaking scene: a group of children, their faces pale and gaunt, huddled together on the cold metal floor. Some clung to each other, their wide eyes darting between the officers, while others just stared too tired to react. James stepped inside and holstered his gun. "You're safe now," he said softly. "We're here to help." Soon after, paramedics arrived and wrapped the children in blankets before taking them to waiting ambulances. The air was heavy with emotion, relief, fear, and a lingering sense of dread. James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. He left the paramedics to take care of the children and joined the chase after the fleeing suspects. His radio crackled with updates. One man was in custody, but the other had slipped through the fog, determined not to let Travers escape. James pushed deeper into the dock's labyrinth and lay. He carefully walked up to a dark office building on the edge of the dock with his gun raised and peered through the broken window. Inside, someone was frantically going through a desk drawer, throwing papers and other things onto the floor. James didn't need a clear view to know it was Harvey Travers. "Hands where I can see them," he yelled, kicking the door open. Travers froze, his hands hovering over the drawer, slowly raising them, his face calm despite the chaos going on around him. "Detective James Travers said, what a surprise." "Step away from the desk," in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Travers did as he was told, but as he moved, his eyes darted around the room, thinking, "I think you're making a mistake. I'm just a middleman. Take me in, and you'll never get to the real players." James advanced his weapon at Travers, which made him laugh. "Funny, that's not what the evidence says. Now turn around and get on the ground." Smirked, "You're in over your head, detective. You may have stopped the shipment, but you'll never stop the network." Before James could answer, Travers lunged for a nearby chair and threw it at James. As James ran for the door, he avoided the chair and tackled Travers to the ground. The two men fought briefly but fiercely, but James's training paid off, and he quickly cuffed Travers. "You're done," James told him, lifting him to his feet. "We'll see how smug you are when." Travers was led away by police officers with a smirk that never wavered. His last words hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the problems that still lay ahead. After the chaos at the docks, the rescued children were taken to the hospital for immediate medical care. Each child was checked for injuries, dehydration, and malnutrition, and psychologists and social workers were brought in to help with their emotional needs. James made sure to visit the hospital the next day, unable to get rid of the images. In one of the pediatric wards, he saw a child whose face was pale and scared. It was one of the boys who had been hiding in the corner of the container with a torn stuffed animal. The boy was now sitting on a hospital bed, his cheeks fuller after just one day of bad food, and he looked up hesitantly when James walked in. "You're the man who found us," the boy said softly. "You're safe now, that's what matters." Many of the children had similar stories, and some were quickly reunited with their families. Parents who had been looking for their children for months were so happy to see them again that tears of relief filled the hospital hall. Other children, whose parents could not be found or were not fit to care for them, remained in the care of social services. James learned that some of the children were immigrants who had been trafficked across borders, which made the case even more complicated. Advocacy groups, legal teams, and local shelters worked hard to make sure these kids did not fall through the cracks. The boy who first led James to the apartment was inseparable from his sister. Both kids were initially quiet and wary of strangers, but they started to open up in front of the child psychologists. They were put in a temporary foster home with plans to reunite them with extended family who had been found in a nearby state. The system wasn't perfect, and James knew that not every child's story would end happily, but for those who had been saved, the horrible things they had been through were finally over as the city skyline stretched away. As James looked out over the city, the weight of the case pressing on his shoulders, he made a silent promise to see this through to the end, no matter how long it took, for every child still waiting to be saved and for those who might never have to go through such horrors. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for now he took a moment to breathe. The boy's journey from the shadows of the city streets to the warmth of his sister's embrace reminded him of why he did this work. He would keep fighting. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you liked the story, please like this video and follow for more.